Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our digital takeout series. A great opportunity to hear from our USU alums talk about their experience and discuss the opportunities that await many of our CHAS students. My name is Joseph Banks. I'm the Assistant Director for Career Services, as well as the dedicated career coach for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone who's here today, as well as any future listeners watching this on YouTube. Before we begin, I just want to let everybody know that that they're able to use the chat feature as well as the question and answers to ask the speaker any questions, and also to know that we have London over here monitoring those to ask after the first part of the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Andrea to introduce our guest today.
Thank you so much, Joe. So my name is Andrea DeHaan. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And today I'm going to be introducing our guest, and we hope that you will take the time to participate and ask questions during our discussion this morning. So our guest today is Brad Plothow, who is an alum in the print journalism program. He graduated in '07 and is currently the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Womply. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our guest before turning the time over to him. Brad leads corporate marketing, product marketing, channel marketing, content and communications, and design at Womply. He and his team are charged with supporting revenue growth, communicating the value of Womply's products, and building the Womply brand into a household name. Prior to Womply, Brad was a partner and executive vice president at Method Communications, where he built and maintained the agency's largest book of business and was the senior strategist for some of the agency's most iconic PR and integrated marketing campaigns for tech startups and venture capital firms. Brad has been enamored with small businesses ever since his frequent visits to the ice cream shop his grandparents owned and operated, and parents, aunts, uncles worked at during his youth. He always roots for the underdog and is passionate about helping small businesses thrive. Brad has a bachelor's degree in journalism and communications and an MBA with an emphasis in management. He lives in Lehi, Utah with his wife and 4 children. And Brad, we are so happy to have you joining us today. And so I'd like to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your history and how you came to these positions, and remind us how you chose your current career path, what you like about that career path, and how you keep up to date with the industry. And again, I will turn the time over to you, and just thank you so much for being here this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everybody. Glad to be here. Always good to reconnect with folks from Utah State University. That was a great time for me. Loved the campus, loved the experience that I had there, and very excited to be chatting with all of you today. I will share a couple of slides to just kind of take you through a little deeper dive into how I got to the place that I'm at, and kind of the meandering path that sometimes we take in our careers. Many of you are probably considering what you're going to do after you graduate from college. When I was in your position many years ago, I wasn't quite sure. I knew directionally what I might want to do. I was trying to acquire some skills that I thought were marketable, but I wasn't sure exactly what the role would be. And I'll tell you, these many years later, I still I'm not sure what the next thing will be. I think that that's part of the excitement and adventure of a career in a field in the humanities or the social sciences or the arts, is that the particulars of your career can really kind of veer in many different directions. So just one moment while I pull up my screen. All right. Are we seeing my screen? Okay, cool. All right, just a bit more as this slide pulls up in a full screen mode about me and my background. So this is kind of a summary. I've spent 17 years in primarily marketing, PR, and journalism. And so I consider those very interrelated disciplines. I was a print journalism emphasis in the program at Utah State, as was mentioned. But I did try to acquire skills that were kind of, on the tangent of print journalism while I was doing that. I've been fortunate to be in the position to kind of work in a lot of leadership capacities over the course of my career. I've spent 12 years as a director or vice president in various kinds of companies, large public organizations, small startups, and kind of everything in between. And one of the things that I've done over the last decade is worked in Utah's growing technology sector. So we've got all these great companies that have been growing up in Utah: Qualtrics, Pluralsight, Vivint, and Structure, Bamboo HR, a whole bunch of others, Domo. And I've worked with most of those companies during their sort of formative years. as an outside sort of consultant for PR and marketing services. And so that's been a big emphasis for me. Another point of emphasis, and I think that this is really something that I honed when I was at Utah State University, is working on executive communications. So if you're an organization or a company, for people to pay attention to you, you might have to have a figurehead. You have to have characters in a story, right? People that you actually care about. And often those people who are part of the central storyline of a company or an organization are the executives. And so I've done a lot of executive communications, building, the thought leadership platform for CEOs, for founders of companies, for PhD researchers, billionaire philanthropists like John Huntsman Sr. And I also did some work with a US congressman. I spent some time in Washington, D.C. As an intern when I was at Utah State, and realized very quickly interning on Capitol Hill in D.C. that did not want to get into politics. It's not for everybody. It definitely wasn't for me. And I've also had the opportunity to be a spokesperson on lots and lots of press interviews. So I started my career on the journalism side, where I was going and requesting interviews, and I've had the opposite opportunity now to be on the other side of that, where I'm giving interviews on a whole bunch of different topics. And so that's been a fun part of my career. Just to kind of take you through the steps. When I was in college, I had spent 5 years before college as a waiter and a busboy in a restaurant. And so I was not eager to repeat that. I'd sort of done my time, I thought. And I was lucky that I had, when I was doing my undergraduate, my first couple of years of undergraduate at Dixie State, I'm from St. George, Utah, so I started there. I had gotten in with the local newspaper down there as a contract writer. So I would mainly do sports writing on the weekends. Occasionally they would throw like a sort of city story at me, and I would do some reporting for the city editor. And I started to build a little bit of a portfolio of news clips with my byline on them. When I moved to Logan and transferred to Utah State University, I went hunting for something similar and just sort of met up with the folks at the Herald Journal, met with their managing editor, met with their sports editor, Sean Harrison, who's still a very good friend today. And thankfully, they had a part-time position in the sports department. And so they said, hey, we can have you, nights and weekends works when you're going to school. And so I was working part-time as a sports writer for the Herald Journal throughout college. Partway through that experience, they said, hey, we had somebody leave. How about full-time? So I was going to college, getting my degree in the JCOM program at Utah State, and then also working full-time. It was more like 30 hours a week, reporting, writing, and also building pages for the newspaper, the Herald Journal in Logan, which was a good experience. It taught me a lot about deadlines. It taught me about how to condense complicated information to the most important things, and do that all without the benefit of a long runway. I was pretty sensitive, though, when I was going to college, to not get pigeonholed just as like a journalist, or just as a sports journalist in particular. And so another opportunity arose when I was there, which was an extended internship with the Utah State University Vice President for Research Office. Some of you who've been around the campus might know Anna McIntyre. She was my boss back then. She's still one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. Really terrific. I believe she's still on campus working there, and she's definitely a huge asset to the university. And she was running marketing across the entire research portfolio for Utah State University. So that included all the peer-reviewed research. So there was technology commercialization. So a researcher might come up with some kind of interesting innovation on the campus. And then it would be like, well, how do we actually take that to market and make a business out of it? And so we would market those efforts. There was also really cool things like the Space Dynamics Lab, which was part of that portfolio. If you haven't seen this new kind of robotic rover that they landed on an asteroid and are collecting asteroid samples this week, the Space Dynamics Lab, I believe, built some of the components that are on that device. So really cool stuff like that coming out of there, and we had the benefit of being able to market that. So then when I came to the end of my time at Utah State University, I was looking for what I was going to do next. I had an in with a company called Utah Media Group, and this is they used to be just sort of like the business arm of the Salt Lake Tribune and the Desert News. If you're not familiar with the business model of those kinds of legacy media companies, they have a joint operating agreement where both of those newspapers are printed in the same facility, and they have a combined rate card. So if you're buying advertising in the Desert News, you're also buying in the Tribune most of the time. So the company that administered all of that was called Utah Media Group, and they were also launching their own editorial products. They were launching news websites, I launched and became the editor of a monthly business magazine called Utah CEO Magazine, which was kind of the primary competitor to Utah Business Magazine. After I left, they actually shuttered that magazine because they used it as leverage to buy Utah Business Magazine. So now Utah Business is owned by Utah Media Group. So that was really, I was sort of like in an editorial setting, sort of a journalistic setting there, but in a very commercial way. So, I was working closely with our ad sales teams to figure out how we could, get traction in the market to have people support these publications and these news properties that we were building. From there, the Great Recession hit when I was about a year and a half into my career out of college. And that was a difficult time. The economy contracted considerably. The company I was working for was really having a difficult time like maintaining our benefits. I had an old friend from my time at Dixie who had then become the head of marketing and communications at Utah Valley University. And he'd been trying to recruit me for a couple of years, and it was a good time to come over and talk to him again. He had a position as a director over their marketing efforts at UVU. The institution had just transitioned from a state college to university status. And so they were trying to basically rebrand one of the largest public institutions in Utah as a university and get people to take it seriously as a university. And so it was a unique challenge, a very interesting opportunity. Joined there, spent 4.5 years trying to install the new UVU brand. Worked very closely with who at the time was the president, Matthew Holland, doing executive communications with him. Worked on all the outdoor billboards that you might see if you're driving through Utah County. Our kind of claim to fame at the time was the Engage campaign, which was meant to position UVU as an engaged learning institution and a university of a particular kind. It wasn't like we wanted to be like BYU or the University of Utah or Utah State. It was a very specific kind of university, and all of our marketing efforts and our communications efforts were geared toward trying to tell that story. After about 4.5 years in academia, it was time for me to kind of go back into the public sector. I was talking with some folks who had just founded a PR agency called Method Communications based in Salt Lake City. There's only about a dozen of them at the time. They provided PR services to primarily technology companies, and they had big ambitions. They wanted to basically own, the technology sector from a communication standpoint in Utah and also expand into Silicon Valley. And so I joined there at the end of 2012 and started working with them. My first clients were in Structure. If you ever use the Canvas learning management system, that was part of the deal. They were a pretty young company at that time. I worked with them until they went public and took them through the IPO process. Also, Vital Smarts, if you've ever read like Crucial Conversations, the authors of those books have a consulting company called Vital Smarts, and they were one of my first clients as well. I also worked with Vivint and Pluralsight, and I was the agency lead for Qualtrics for a number of years. So lots of the kind of Utah well-known companies were in our portfolio. I also worked with a whole bunch of companies in the San Francisco Bay Area, including large venture capital firms, really interesting startups in both the consumer and the B2B space. And so had kind of a foot in Silicon Valley and a foot in Silicon Slopes. And then after about 4 years there, the agency life is rewarding, but it's also brutal. It can take a big toll. It was kind of always on, and I had a lot of clients, and they always needed things. Even on the weekends, you're watching a movie sometimes in a theater, and it's like, oh, my phone's going off, and someone needs me right now. I had clients in Israel and in New Zealand at one point, and in the UK, and so no time was safe. Even in the middle of the night, you might be getting calls or texts that were in need of attention. So decided to go in-house, and there was a company called Womply, San Francisco-based software company and data company, and they build software for small businesses primarily, and that was interesting to me. I'd seen lots of companies build software for large companies and give them all kinds of advantages, so why not try to help the little guy for once? Very interested in what they were doing. I've been at Womply for the last 4 years, going on 4 years, helping to build. When I joined, there was no marketing, no communications at all. They were pretty young and nascent, and so I've been building that department from the ground up ever since. And today, a lot of what I do is working with the news media. We get about 18 press hits per day right now at Womply, based on the insights that we provide around how consumers are interacting with small businesses. And so we have a pretty robust earned media machine that we use at Womply. So that's sort of the career summary. A couple of other things that I think might be of interest. I think when I was at Method Communications, one of the things that we did was we would use pop culture to try to get into the news cycle. So, for example, we did a campaign where we partnered with AMC and Instructure to create a free online college course about The Walking Dead, which at the time was the most popular TV show in basic cable history, and it was sort of like about the science of survival. So, in a zombie apocalypse, how would you think about nutrition? How would you think about the physics of whether a crossbow bolt actually would go through a zombie's head or get stuck in the zombie's head? So we would use all these applied multidisciplinary academic topics and apply it to a zombie scenario. So there are some fun things you can do in communications that are not just run of the mill. We've done some interesting campaigns over the years where we've invoked pop culture and things that people actually care about. And then the last thing I'll just say before I turn it back to the good folks at Chas, and we can do some Q&A here, is just, I think this is useful. I used to think about, lanes that you have to stay in as a professional. And so when I was trying to decide what I should major in college, I was like, oh, print journalism, is that going to pigeonhole me? Is it going to send me down a path where I have to be in that world forever? And I mentioned at the top that I've been, sort of in journalism, public relations, and marketing. And I've had, these different kinds of industries I've worked in, from media to academia to technology. And I would say that I've utilized the skills that apply to each of these different disciplines in all of these different industries, and they're highly transferable. So I think that rather than, the way I thought about college and my education when I was, in your shoes many, many years ago, as being sort of like a path that launches you down, one direction and there is no way back. These skills really do have a high degree of marketability across a number of different fields and a number of different industries. So as long as you know how to market yourself, which is a skill that you're probably learning as well, you can definitely make a case that all these things are very relevant to an array of different employers. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn the time back over to Joseph.
All right. Great, Brad. Awesome. That is a great history and a pretty awesome career that you've been going through. I just want you to ask a question here. So thinking back to like your days, at USU and such, what was like one of your key takeaways that you took from your university days? And also, how have you seen that applied in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think one of the things when I was going to Utah State, one of the first required classes we had to take was media smarts, and so this was sort of like a foundational class about how to think critically about the information that you consume, and to consume sometimes media that maybe you're not that interested in, to understand why maybe somebody else may be interested in it and what makes it compelling, what makes it interesting, because we really are creatures who respond to stories. And I think that one of the things that I've sort of learned through that process was, first of all, how to be more critical about the information that I consume, but also how to think about, what kinds of things I should be doing to stay relevant in my career. So one of the things that was suggested here is, what things do you do to stay relevant? There's kind of a couple of ways you could approach that. One is that you just steep yourself in the industry. So if you're in public relations, for example, you follow the PRSA and everything they put out, all their content is what you consume. You follow blogs from, the Holmes Report or Bulldog Reporter or whatever. And that's what you stay very narrowly focused. And I found that there's some value to that, but I've also found, based again on what I learned in that first section of my schooling at Utah State, that really what we're trying to do as professional marketers, communicators, or journalists is make sense of the world and make connections between things. So I actually find a lot more value now, and I'll read like the Marketing Brew morning newsletter every morning, but I'll also read the Axios AM newsletter that is just a rundown of the most important current events of the day. Because if you can make connections between what people are paying attention to because they care about it and what you're doing with your company or your organization that are authentic, that makes sense, it makes a kind of more, it makes relevance where there would be none otherwise. So I would say that, that was an important learning for me, is that, being really narrow in what kind of information you consume is a career limiting move.
Thank you, Brad. And I know that you are someone, as someone who follows you on LinkedIn, you are someone who stays on top of trends, and it's obvious that you are gleaming that information and trying to make it relevant to your industry. When you talk though about things that you're trying to connect, events to the industry, right now we're dealing with COVID, and is that something that the industry could have seen coming? And more specifically, how have marketing and communications professionals been impacted by COVID, and how can you prepare for such a crisis? Or you talked about in your own experience, you graduated right at the time of that economic downturn. These things are often surprises, but marketing and communications professionals, I think, have to be reactive, but are there also ways in which you can be proactive?
Yeah, I think it's still a fluid situation, and so I think the answers to that question are still being written. However, I think there are a couple things that, having gone through the previous recession, and now we're certainly in a recession, even if we've papered over it with lots and lots of stimulus money. I think that the real economy is doing far worse than than sort of the metrics would suggest today. So this is going to be a challenge for all of us, especially those of us who are trying to establish value. So I would say this: when I went through the period of the Great Recession, and I think this applies to now, you really can't see these things coming. Even economists get blindsided by it. And if you have a 40-year career, you're gonna deal with probably 4 or 5 recessions. They're a fact of life. I think that it's not something to be too terrified of. It shouldn't be something that like makes you play tight. These things do occur on a regular basis because our economy requires reset from time to time. So I wouldn't let it alter the way you think about things. What I would suggest, though, is that the best advice I've gotten about maintaining relevance in spite of the conditions is to be known for one particular thing, like being in the top 1% of a particular thing. So you can be good at lots of things, and at the beginning of your career, the first 5 years or so, you should be trying lots of things and doing lots of things and building competencies in lots of areas so you have versatility. I think my investments in trying to like learn transferability of different skills and learn an array of skills and get experiences in different areas really served me well later on. Later on, though, you really do want to start to kind of hone in and say, how do I build my own personal brand around competency in one area? So, for example, we serve small businesses at Womply. And so small businesses have been, disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And because they're our bread and butter, our business has certainly been affected. But nobody in my small shop has been let go or laid off, even though we've had some furloughs in other areas and layoffs in other areas, because there's a recognition of value that would be very difficult to replace because of the team that we've built and the things that they do in sort of the 1%, competency in specifically in media relations and content marketing. So, my boss, I think in the back of his mind knows I have a good relationship with him, but also he knows, if I were to go and try to save, 20% or 30% on hiring cheaper people to do this, I might not get just 20 or 30% less results. I may get far worse results than that. And so, having that in the back of people's minds that you work for, that your value is very difficult to replace, takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of focus. But I think that that's the only real currency you have, is like, how difficult would I be to replace? And some of that comes down to, your hard skills. It also comes down to, I think, some of your soft skills. So having a nose for value, like being perceptive, like people in this field of communications, marketing, journalism tend to be more perceptive by nature, or at least they hone those skills. Being perceptive, not just about what's going on in the world, but also what your company cares about, is a really significant skill. So you can, frame, for example, the work you're doing through the lens of what the company cares about or what the organization cares about. That's a very underrated skill. I see so many people who are doing good work in different functions of, the various companies I've worked for, who don't know how to play it back in a meaningful way to the people that they're accountable to. So a couple of things there. I think one is just like really establishing your value, and then also articulating that value and learning how to present it, like merchandising the results of your work.
No, Brad, I was thinking is a pretty great how, when you're talking about your history, that you went from, one of the main reasons you went over to Womply is because you wanted to help serve those small businesses. And so this next question is kind of related to both, COVID and the small businesses. Have you noticed, I guess, your role in being able to serve those clients, and thinking as far as those clients that you serve, has it actually made marketing and PR kind of more important for them? And has it changed like the platforms and the systems that you use to help do the marketing for them?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to answer that. First of all, I'll address the elephant in the room just so that people aren't fixated on this. The name Womply is very unusual, and it comes from our company's founder grew up in Australia, and there's these creatures there called wombats. They look like giant, almost like koala bears almost. And he had a pet wombat, and he named it Womply. So he named our company Womply in memory of his childhood pet. So if the name means nothing to most people, it does mean something to our founder. But I think there's two parts to that question, like how are small businesses being affected by COVID, and then what can they do about it? And so, first of all, I would say if you're a large company, you can invest a lot of resources into the problem of understanding the health of your business. This is something we take for granted. Most people don't really know the health of their business, at least not in relative terms, right? So a large company, there's a company in Utah called Domo, and they specialize in just taking the business data that explains the health of a business and turning it into charts. And so you can create a little dashboard that the CEO can read every day and say, how's my business doing? If you're following the state's COVID-19 response, you'll see that there's a dashboard of charts that they update every day. Businesses do this to understand their own health of their company as well. And so small businesses, though, if you think about Juniper Takeout, in Logan, one of my favorite places up there, or some of these small salons or auto shops, they're not doing that. They're like very few people. They don't have that kind of sophistication, and there aren't very great tools that are built for that. So one of the things that we've been doing is, because we have transaction data for millions of small businesses, we have a great view of our consumer spending more or less right now with small businesses. What is the general health of the small business economy? How is the health of small business in Logan, Utah versus St. George, Utah versus the Bay Area in California, or upstate New York? And so we've been sharing those insights through press, through content. We also make those insights available in our platform to small businesses, because the first step is in understanding if you need to do something is just knowing. You might have a gut instinct to say, hey, it feels like sales are more slow. But if you don't know that, like, the rest of the market is down, so maybe your sales are a reflection of the market, or maybe it's that you've reached some like shift in seasonality that's affected by, for example, people changing their behaviors because of a pandemic. That kind of information is important to understand how you're going to respond. So one of the things that we've done in the last couple of months, we added a remote payment option through Womply. So we didn't used to take payments through Womply. We just worked with credit card processors who processed those payments. We took the payment data and then served it back to the small business so they could understand their business, run marketing campaigns, reactivate their customers, all that kind of stuff. Now we realize that they need remote payments because there's been a ton of studies that most consumers are having a hard time handling cash, or even like credit cards. They don't want to touch point of sale systems. They don't want to touch and handle cash. And that's maybe a little different dynamic in Utah, where folks are maybe a little more skeptical of kind of COVID as a problem. But in other places, especially the coast where they got hit really hard months and months ago, this is a real problem. So that's one way in which we've said, look, here's a trend that we see. It's visible in the data. We saw that it's not just lockdowns that are starving small businesses of transactions. It's consumer behavior. People just don't want to go out and spend as much money, and that has a vicious cycle effect on small businesses. One way that they can adjust to that is say, hey, if you come and spend money with us, we're not going to make you touch a point of sale system or hand us over dirty cash.
Thank you, Brad. It's so interesting to hear, that viewpoint about, as you say, it's not just the company themselves, but the consumer and how all of those things are interrelated. Before I move to my last question, I do want to remind those of you listening this morning that We are here to take questions from you, and our events intern will be leading a Q&A here shortly. So I see that we've had some questions come in through the Q&A and through the chat, but please keep those coming, as Brad is a wonderful resource and he would love to answer those questions for you. So Brad, my final question to you is, what would you recommend the students who are listening this morning, or those who watch in the future, could do to help market themselves, both in the current environment and in the future?
Yeah, I think there are a handful of things. One is there's no substitute for substance. And so hard skills in the early part of your career go a long way. So I know a lot of, people who will lean on their soft skills. I'm great with people. And I think that's really important, but it's usually not sufficient if you want to stand out early in your career. And so the acquisition of some kind of hard skills, whether those are writing skills, maybe you're learning the Adobe Creative Suite, and you have some competence there. It could be photography, it could be any number of things. But if you have those hard skills, you're going to get at bats that you wouldn't get otherwise, and you're going to be seen as somebody who has versatility that is really important. And if you're multidimensional early in your career, it helps you to pick a lane later on that you can specialize in and be in that 1%. So an example of that. I have a colleague that works with me now that I recruited. I worked with him at Method, and then I recruited him to come work with me now. And part of the reason is because he's demonstrated that he has some hard skills that matter. It's not just like, oh, I can, pitch journalists, it's a combination of hard skills that go into that. But for example, we had a client that needed us to build what they call a sizzle reel, like take all the press coverage we'd gotten for them and turn it into like a short video with some music, so they could present that to their investors. And this guy raised his hand and said, well, I've got some decent After Effects experience, and I can work on a video. And so he jammed and built a video for us. And he was 2 years out of college at the time. And that gave us confidence in, first of all, his confidence in understanding how to shape up all of this stuff into a story. But also he had the technical skill to do it. We didn't have to go and outsource that. That was value that we saw. So I think that's really important, is to not skimp on the hard skill, especially early on. But the other thing I think is resume writing and how you curate yourself on LinkedIn is also a skill. It's not something that comes naturally. Nobody emphasizes or has a minor in resume writing. But that's the first exercise in learning how to market yourself. And then this happens on and on and on throughout your career. So right now, I'm preparing slides for our board of directors at Womply, and everything is about how do you project back to them the value of the work that you're doing. And that is a very relevant and timely skill that I have to have right now. And if I don't have it right now, I would be up a creek. I would be a pretty ineffective vice president for this company. And so that is something you start honing when you're looking for your first job out of college, is how do you present yourself, call out the right things, have the right points of emphasis, keep it clean, and so that it's not overwhelming. If somebody looks at your resume and it's nothing but words and they don't see any room to breathe, the word wall is overwhelming and you won't break through. And so if you don't know somebody who's got some expertise in resume writing, find a mentor who can work through that with you and help you optimize your LinkedIn page, because that really does matter. I look at people's LinkedIn pages when we're doing interviews all the time now, and if my eyes glaze over, it has a negative impact for me. And if it's something that sings a little bit and I can see quickly who they are and what they can do, then I sort of make a mental note of that. And I think that that's pretty common. So a couple of concrete things that you can do at this phase of your education and career.
Brad, thank you so much for everything you've shared so far. And now we're going to move on to the question and answer portion. So I'm going to be telling you some of the questions that are coming in from our viewers today. So to start it off, we were just talking about hard skills. So in terms of hard skills, you obviously had some important job opportunities early on, but were there skills you had to learn on the job? Or in other words, if students are looking to acquire skills that go beyond the classroom, do you have suggestions for how to become self-taught in some of these areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think some of this requires a fair amount of resourcefulness, because you're not going to learn all of the skills in an undergraduate degree that you're going to need. And there's just no possible way to do that. I will say that when I was going through the JCOM program in my day, it had an emphasis on skill development that I think was unique. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to go to Utah State as opposed to, I was looking at BYU and Utah at the same time. And I felt like the emphasis on hard skill was really important. But it's never going to be sufficient because there's so much theory and like academic work that you need to get to just understand, the context for all these things that you're doing. So you have to supplement it. I would say that in any of the disciplines that I've worked in, marketing, journalism, public relations, the core skill is writing. And if you're an excellent writer and you can stand out on your writing skill, it translates into everything else that you do. And it's primarily nonfiction writing, right? You're not writing, creatively in most cases, unless you're doing, some kind of long form advertising or something. And so learning how to communicate effectively and with power succinctly is very important. The one thing I can suggest is there is a group called the Poynter Institute, which is a journalism think tank, and they have one of the guys who's there. His name is Roy Peter Clark, and he has a book called 50 Writing Tools. And if you read that, and just if you did nothing else, internalize those 50 tools, that I think is huge. I'll tell you, when I was working in the PR industry, I entered that later in my career. I was surprised by how many people who were in PR had pretty marginal writing skill, and those who were better writers had an advantage over those who were poorer writers. And I've seen that, even in things like in marketing, where there's times where if you're a product marketer, you think your job is just to understand benefits of products and how to like make a hierarchy of like benefits and features. But eventually you got to put pen to paper and you have to write those things down in a compelling way that makes people want to buy the product. And so we still do communicate through words as the primary medium. And so learn that skill and hone and refine that skill, and you'll stand out.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So one of our viewers, they mentioned with hard skills, aside from like writing and video editing, are there other hard skills that you can learn to help market yourself?
I think this is a softer skill. So I think there are other hard skills. I'll answer that, but I'll also give you a softer skill. So hard skills, I think also you're not going to get away from math. I chose communications because I wanted to avoid as much math as possible. Actually, when I was doing my generals, I was like, I think I want to go into medicine. And I very quickly was like, nope, I don't want that much math and biology. And so I shifted gears. And I was deliberately trying to like avoid the quantitative stuff. I'll tell you, like every stop I've made, I've had to at least understand how to use a pivot table in Excel. And how to do some basic math, and sometimes even like some not so basic math. And so I would say that the world is becoming more quantifiable, and there is more of an appetite for quantifying things. In the work that I do, for example, we go out to the news media. Every single day we're pitching something to somebody in the press, whether it's like CNN or the New York Times or a regional newspaper or radio station. And what we're doing is we're taking massive amounts of transaction data in a spreadsheet, and we're trying to make that as simple as possible to understand, so we have a story to tell. So for example, 20% of small businesses since the pandemic started have closed. We know that because we're every day updating a pivot table in Excel. And so without having some basic quant skills and Excel skills, we would be very handicapped in our ability to tell that story through the written word and through broadcast media and so forth. So don't skimp on at least some basic competency in math. Unfortunately, I know that there's folks who are probably not liking to hear that. The other thing I would say is, and I didn't take this seriously enough early in my career, this is a soft skill. Networking is something that comes very naturally for some people, and it's like going to an event and swapping business cards or whatever. The extroverts kind of shine in that environment. But I've learned that there are lots of ways to network. For example, just reaching out to somebody on LinkedIn who has been sharing content that you like and just saying, hey, I love your content. For me, with no expectation of any reciprocation or like transaction or anything, for me, sometimes those relationships that have grown over time, even in a digital like setting like LinkedIn, have turned into meaningful things like job opportunities or offers or consulting opportunities and so forth. So find a way to learn how to network based on your personality set, even if it's just sort of, doing it the social media way. I think that's underrated as well.
So now our next question kind of relates to tech, because you have a nice background in working with tech companies. So we know that tech companies and the companies that serve them rely on a variety of skills, but we often don't associate tech with CHAS. So can you tell us more about your transition to serving the needs of tech companies? Were there skills you had to learn on the job that helped you meet those needs?
Yeah, tech is interesting because you're right. Most of the technology companies in Utah are software companies. And so they're not building anything that you can touch and feel. They're building something that you log into and that you create an account for. And that's the majority of software companies these days. It's software as a service, it's a subscription. And so they're going to lean very heavily on engineers, software engineers who are writing code. They have like a very strong propensity for hiring what's called growth marketers, which are basically like analysts and like spreadsheet jockeys who figure out how to create like an experimentation framework. And if we run A/B tests on this ad and this ad on Facebook, which one wins? And then how can we test another one? And so it's very analytical and very quantitative. And I think that, tech companies in a particular market go through an evolution where at first they're very focused on those kinds of basic things. And as they start to grow up, like it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you got to take care of food and shelter before you can worry about the things that are upstream. And so if you're not bringing in revenue as an early stage company, it's very difficult for you to worry about things like, well, are we telling a compelling story as a company that helps us really break through? But we're at a different place now in Utah. So the companies that I was working with, call it, 8 years ago, were all very early stage, and they were worried about food and shelter. They were worried about revenue, and they cared more about that than they did the things that come upstream from that. What I realized though was that there is a place for the things that we do. At the end of the day, A/B tests don't sell products. You don't buy things because you've been optimized as a user. You buy things because you come in contact with something that resonates with you and compels you to action. It's a story. So storytelling as a skill is something that is not fully appreciated in Utah technology yet, but it's getting there. The combination of the analytical and the creative and telling stories that matter and being able to deliver those stories through sophisticated growth marketing methodologies is like a really powerful combination. And I've been trying to make this, case over the last decade. I've been doing this to companies, and some of them get this, some of them don't. The same is true with like the PR world. At some point, companies go out and they're like, well, we're raising a big round of venture capital, private investment in our business. And so we want to tell the story. We're ready to tell our story. And so they go hire a PR agency. And then they're like, well, let's just keep this PR agency after we've announced our funding, and they can keep on getting us in the Wall Street Journal and stuff. Well, it doesn't work that way, because the thing that made you newsworthy was that you raised money. Now what makes you newsworthy? And so the work that I've done has been trying to figure out, how do you make a company inherently interesting outside of the fact that it's raised money or launched a new product? And so there is a place and a market for those kinds of skills. And there's been more and more recognition of that as companies have gone from very early stage companies in Utah to later stage companies. And some of these companies like Qualtrics are large multinational organizations now. And so there are lots of different places for someone with a CHAS degree inside of the communications or the marketing part of the org, or maybe even, in some cases in, HR or CS. Workfront, as an example, a Utah technology company, has communications pros who are alumni from Utah State working in HR doing internal communications. So there are more places for us than it might appear at first glance.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So it looks like the last question I'm going to have for you today, coming in from the chat, is more about your time at USU. So you already mentioned some of the things that you found most valuable. You mentioned how you thought the Media Smarts class was really great and how you got a lot of different experiences. This question is just simply, what are some of those most valuable things at USU? Is there anything else you haven't mentioned yet that you found most valuable?
First of all, I say this totally seriously. There's not a prettier campus on this earth. And I think that, that's easy to forget, but I feel like learning, my mind is more open to learning when I'm in a place that inspires me, and that campus is inspiring. And so I think that's a huge advantage that every student at Utah State has, is that place is special. The physical place is special. I also think that, when I look back at my education at Utah State, I felt like, there was a great blend of the academic and the practical in the world that I was working in. So one example of that was, again, as a print journalism major. And I remember one night, Mike Sweeney was the department chair at that time. He lives in Ohio now, but he said, "Hey, I got this really weird text message from somebody. They said that Joe Wilson, who was an ambassador for the United States way back in the day, is going to be in Pocatello, Idaho, of all places. And he's going to make a big announcement." Now, this was back, in the kind of the follow on of the Iraq war. And there was, this guy, Joe Wilson, his wife had been outed as a CIA operative and there was a belief that it was for political reasons. It was a very complex story, but basically it was the kind of thing that might result in big indictments of government officials because there was some weird stuff going on. Well, of all the places for this person who was a central figure in a global story to be, he was in Pocatello, Idaho, and he said he's going to have news tonight. So we're all thinking, oh, he's got news that they're going to hand down indictments in this case. And so Mike Sweeney tells me, he's like, "You can go there, and as a student reporter for our student blog, you could be the one that breaks the story because you'll get to it before anybody else gets to it." So I said, "Let me do it." I drove to Pocatello that night. I was newly married. My wife drove me, and I took a laptop with me, listened to the thing, and he did indeed reveal that that there were indictments coming down. And so I typed this thing up on a laptop while we're driving, through like the hinterlands of Idaho, back to Cache Valley late at night. I got home at like 2 a.m., filed a story. Mike was waiting for it, and he published it. And we broke the news as a student newspaper of this cool thing that happened that rippled throughout like the national news and the international news. And so I can't say that I've had people that was a unique experience, but I had other experiences that were not quite so grandiose that were like that, where you had a chance to do something and get your hands into things that you might not get to do other places. And I have, friends who've had great educations at other universities, but they haven't had those kinds of opportunities. And so to the extent that that you lean in and raise your hand for those kinds of things, I think those can be very valuable opportunities. That kind of clip gave me opportunities, to stand out against other candidates for jobs early in my career. And so, I think that, some places the faculty and staff look for reasons to say no. And my experience at Utah State was that they look for reasons to say yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brad. Those have been really good feedback. And the one thing I wanted to, I guess, comment on, thanks so much for mentioning about networking. I just want to echo the same thing, how important it is to network right now. And not only that, but how networking doesn't always have to be transactional, how it's not just, oh, I'm going to do something for you, or maybe you're going to do something for me, but that you can just actually show appreciation for some of the different articles and stuff that can be a really good networking tool. So thanks so much, Brad, and thanks for being able to spend some time with us.
Thank you all. It's been great.
Brad, we've so enjoyed having you today. As Joe said, thank you for sharing your insights and giving, I think the listeners a lot of really practical advice that is actionable and that they could really take on if they wanted to start, looking toward their future after graduation. I do want to also thank the audience who participated today and asked questions and listened in. We're talking about networking. We're talking about ways to say yes to opportunities. And we appreciate you saying yes today and coming to hear from Brad and hear about his insights. I hope this has been helpful for you. And I do want to let everyone know that we will be concluding our series for fall semester on November 5th. We'll actually be speaking to our dean. While he is not an alumni, he has made an incredible push for alumni engagement with our college and has been forefront in the reason why we're able to talk to people like Brad today, and very supportive of this initiative. And so he's going to be talking with us as our guest on November 5th about the transference of the skills that you're acquiring through CHAS and places you can take that, because no one knows our alumni better than Dean Ward, who has been out to meet a lot of alums like Brad and has brought them back to us. So if you have questions about today's event, we encourage you to follow up with us. You have the information for Joe and myself. And Brad, would it be okay as well if students were to reach out to you if they have questions, or if they want to, ask you or connect on LinkedIn? Is that something you're open to as well?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We appreciate that. And students, we hope you will take that to heart. And I thank everyone for joining us today. And I wish everyone a safe and healthy afternoon. And we hope you'll come back and join us again in November for our last installment of the Digital Takeout for Fall 2020. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.